If you think back, before economics felt like it needed a whole chalkboard full of Greek letters to explain anything.
Right, when it was still philosophy.
Exactly. For centuries, it wasn't math. It was moral philosophy. It was history, a bit of social commentary.
And it was messy. I mean, it was human and argumentative. When you read the early giants, Adam Smith on moral sentiments, or someone like Thorstein Veblen talking about status games.
Conspicuous consumption.
That's the one. They were writing about ambition and fear and human nature. And of course, you had John Maynard Keynes, who was obsessed with panic, with uncertainty, with what he famously called animal spirits.
That sheer, almost irrational force of human emotion that drives everything.
It's the gut feeling. And then somewhere in the mid-20th century, that whole intellectual landscape just shifts dramatically.
All of a sudden, the conversation wasn't about moral judgments anymore.
Not at all. Economics started speaking almost exclusively in the language of equations. Graphs replaced stories.
Elegant proofs were in. Messy human stories were out. The whole discipline started to present itself as this neutral, objective science, almost mimicking the authority of physics.
And our source material argues that this change, it wasn't some kind of grassroots demand from society. It was the calculated effort of one figure who gave the field the scientific credibility it had always been craving.
We're talking about Paul Samuelson.
That's him.
So our mission for this deep dive is to really get into that intellectual history. We want to understand Samuelson's method, the big compromises he had to make to get that mathematical elegance, and why, when you look at modern policy.
From the Fed's interest rates to trade agreements.
Right. Why it so often feels like it's built on assumptions that just don't match up with lived human experience.
Yeah.
We're unpacking how economics went from philosophy to physics. Okay. So to really grasp the scale of the shift Samuelson pulled off, we have to understand the crisis that came
That's
before.
the credibility vacuum.
Exactly. In the 1920s, classical economic theory was king. It was all about self-correcting markets, rational individuals, stability.
A very beautiful, coherent worldview. The idea was basically you leave the market alone and everything will sort itself out perfectly. Any deviations would be, temporary. That was the baseline.
But then reality delivered a knockout punch, the Great Depression.
And you really can't overstate how big a failure this was. I mean, the magnitude.
Oh.
It was just
output collapse.
Completely. Unemployment went through the roof for a decade. Banks were failing in these cascading waves.
And the beautiful self-correcting classical theory, it had no answer.
None. No practical, timely answer. It wasn't just an economic crisis. It was an ideological catastrophe for the entire profession.
They couldn't tell policymakers what to do.
Other than wait it out. And that level of helplessness that created this massive credibility vacuum.
And this is where Keynes just bursts onto the scene. He breaks all the rules.
He does. He doesn't wait. He argues that markets can and often will stay irrational and depressed far longer than people can stay solvent. So his solution was
the government has to step in.
Aggressive, counter-cyclical government intervention. Inject demand, get things moving again.
And it worked. I mean, the New Deal policies, they were flawed, sure, but they started to stabilize things.
They did. They were a practical necessity. But, and this is the absolute crucial distinction, Keynes' theories were intuitive, they were psychological, and they were fundamentally political.
You had to accept that humans are irrational and that the state has power.
Right. And that kind of messiness made a lot of economists, deeply uncomfortable.
So after World War II, the stakes get even higher.
Much higher. Governments are bigger. You have these new global institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. They've got unprecedented policy reach.
They weren't looking for a persuasive essay anymore.
No, they weren't looking for a philosophical debate. Policy had stopped being a debate club. It was now an engineering problem. Economics had to sound authoritative. It had to sound objective, above the political fray. It needed a roadmap.
So you have this real vacuum, this intense demand for justification. And if Keynes sort of solved the immediate problem, the survival problem, who built the foundation for the next 70 years?
That was Paul Samuelson. He was a different kind of thinker, not a revolutionary like Marx or Keynes. He was a system builder, a prodigy.
He looked at the chaos of economic theory, all the competing schools and arguments, and he just saw disorder.
Total disorder. And he had this deep, almost religious admiration for the elegance of math and physics, classical mechanics especially.
He famously said that economics suffered from a credibility problem because it talked too much and proved too little.
It needed to be elevated. The ambition was nothing short of turning economics into a deductive science. If Newton could describe the motion of planets with a few equations.
Samuelson thought economics should be able to describe markets in a similar way.
Exactly. To create this abstract, unified framework that applied everywhere, from one person's choice at the grocery store to the entire national economy.
Which brings us to 1947 and his book, Foundations of Economic Analysis.
Which wasn't a policy manifesto at all. It was a mathematical one. He was signaling his goal to create one unified formal structure for everything.
But to get that kind of elegance, you have to make some compromise.
A monumental compromise. To make his subjects, you and me, businesses, mathematically clean, he had to introduce the one core modeling assumption that everything since has rested on.
Which is
He will optimize.
optimize. So consumers always maximize their satisfaction. Firms always maximize their profit.
Perfectly.
Perfectly. But people are famously messy. We're irrational. How on earth could he defend that as a description of reality?
Well, that's the thing. He didn't. Not really as a description of reality anyway.
Okay.
And this is the key subtlety that gets lost later. For Samuelson, it was explicitly a modeling assumption.
Just a tool to make the math work.
It was the necessary simplification to get the math to work, to use differential calculus, the same tools from physics, to find these clear points of equilibrium and predictable responses.
So he wasn't saying people are perfectly rational. He was saying we have to assume they are, or the equations fall apart and we can't build the system.
Precisely. It was a tactical, intellectual move. And that one move had this profound psychological impact on the whole profession.
Because by borrowing the math of physics,
They also borrowed its supreme confidence. Suddenly, you could generate clear, authoritative predictions. Prices respond to incentives. Supply meets demand. Shocks are just temporary deviations from a stable baseline.
you can just imagine the feeling in the academy. After decades of arguing about morality and psychology, now they have equations.
A literal license to sound like scientists. The autonomy was now a complex machine, sure, but a machine that could be analyzed and tuned and corrected by experts.
So this newfound mathematical confidence, this sets the stage for what is maybe his most enduring contribution, right?
Yeah.
The neoclassical synthesis.
It's certainly his most politically significant, yeah. This was his big attempt to reconcile the wild, disruptive ideas of Keynes with the elegant, structured world of classical free market economics.
Building a roof over both camps.
A very sturdy intellectual roof. And it was brilliant, both as politics and as math. The core idea is this. Markets are generally efficient. That's the classical view. That's the default.
Okay.
But sometimes they malfunction. They cause deep slumps, crises. When they do, the government can and should step in with Keynesian tools to stabilize things.
And once stability returns.
The system reverts back to the classical efficient equilibrium. The markets take over again.
That seems almost too convenient. Wasn't that criticized as being intellectually vulnerable? Like you use Keynes to justify bailouts when things are bad,
Yeah.
but you use classical theory to justify deregulation when things are good.
Oh, absolutely. Critics called it intellectual opportunism and argued it created a policy framework that was incredibly flexible for the powerful. But from the standpoint of institutional stability, it was a profound success.
It satisfied everyone who mattered.
It did. It preserved the respectability of the free market idea while also legitimizing, and this is key, limiting government intervention. Economics finally had a single defensible, teachable story.
And then he put that story into a textbook.
And not just any textbook, economics. An introductory analysis became arguably the most influential economics book ever written. It trained generations of students who then went on to staff the Fed, the Treasury, the World Bank.
So it didn't just explain the field, it defined what the field was.
And that's the moment it gets locked in. Once a framework becomes the curriculum, the required reading,
It just becomes the way things are.
it stops being questioned fundamentally. The core assumptions like optimization and equilibrium, they just become invisible. They're the default. And so any other way of thinking ideas about power dynamics or psychology or instability, they start to look unprofessional.
Unscientific.
Right, unscientific. Not just different, the institutionalization filters out all the humility of the original thinkers.
So if we step back and connect this to the bigger picture, it feels like in gaining all of this precision and legitimacy, something really essential was lost.
There was a trade-off.
Okay, so let's define that loss. What was traded away for mathematical elegance?
Well, for one, human behavior became stylized. It got reduced to these clean lines on a graph. Power dynamics, the actual messy relationship between, say, labor and capital, that all just faded into the background.
And Keynes' big insight, psychology, the animal spirits.
That got treated as noise, just temporary noise that would wash out in the long run.
And this mathematical distance, it became a kind of shield for policymakers, didn't it?
It really did. When central banks and institutions adopt this super technical language, decisions can be framed as a technical necessity.
What the model says we have to do.
Exactly. Not a moral choice, not a political choice to be debated. The models became more than tools. They became political justifications.
But this this created a massive blind spot.
The primary blind spot. The whole Samuelsonian worldview assumes stability and equilibrium are the natural state. So crises are always treated as external shocks, like a meteor hitting the machine.
Which sounds fine until you realize that financial systems create their own meteors.
They absolutely do. The framework it struggles with phenomena that refuse to behave politely. Things that are internal to the system. Asset bubbles, panics, bank runs, systemic crashes.
They're too emotional, too nonlinear.
Too human to fit into a neat equilibrium model that assumes everyone is rational.
And the 2008 financial crisis just exposed this tension in the most brutal way possible.
It really did. You had these incredibly sophisticated mathematical models pricing risk down to the decimal point, assuming rational behavior, assuming stable liquidity.
Until all those assumptions failed at the exact same time.
And here's the really brutal part. The models didn't just fail to predict the crisis.
They made it worse.
They actively facilitated it. They gave everyone this false sense of security, a sense that risk had been tamed, that if you just spread it around enough, it effectively disappeared.
Because the math said so.
The map told them the terrain was flat, but in reality, they were climbing a cliff.
And when the whole system cracked,
yeah,
what was the response? It wasn't a rejection of the foundations.
Not at all. For the most part, it was to patch the structure. We saw massive liquidity injections, near zero interest rates, all justified using the same technical language of the synthesis that had just failed.
The deep irony is the same models that failed to account for the crisis were immediately used to manage its aftermath.
Which just shows you how reluctant the system was to question the very foundations that failed.
So this leaves us with Samuelson's legacy, which is, well, it's complicated. On the one hand, he created the structure that allowed for this incredible global coordination during a crisis. It probably helped prevent a total collapse after 2008.
It did. That's a huge positive. The models provided a framework, a sense of structure and reassurance when panic was setting in.
But at the same time, the distance between the decision makers and the public it widened dramatically.
Massively. When policies like quantitative easing are framed as these mathematical necessities that are beyond the grasp of the average person, public trust just erodes.
Right. People experience soaring asset prices and rising inequality, and it feels like the system is being run by and for a small group of experts. You feel totally excluded from the dialogue.
And when the experts sound certain but your lived experience feels unfair, that's a perfect recipe for distrust.
And the thing we have to remember is that Samuelson himself, he probably understood this better than a lot of the people who followed him.
That's the real tragedy here. He knew his models were simplifications. He cautioned against taking them too literally. He had the humility of a scholar introducing a new tool.
But when that tool became institutionalized,
when it became mandatory, that humility got filtered out. The understanding that messy human psychology and political conflict still exist outside the equation, that was lost. The precision survived, but the wisdom didn't.
So the essential distinction for you, for the listener, has to be this. Rejecting modern economics entirely is a mistake.
A huge mistake. The field gives us incredible tools for managing complexity. The answer isn't to abandon the models, it's to remember what they are.
They're maps.
They are maps, not the territory. Samuelson gave us an elegant, detailed map, but no map can ever capture every obstacle, every pothole, every shift in the underlying geography. A good map actually makes you humble about the journey ahead.
And what really stands out is that financial systems don't fail because people ignore the models.
They fail when people in charge start to believe the models have eliminated uncertainty altogether. History doesn't repeat because the equations are wrong. It repeats because we humans consistently overestimate how much we've actually tamed complexity.
So we've seen how Paul Samuelson gave economics the precision and authority it needed, but at the cost of pushing out all that human messiness.
And modern policy sounds certain right up until the moment it isn't. Understanding that tension is everything.
Which means protecting your financial freedom, your understanding today, requires more than just trusting the expert consensus. It means you have to understand the assumptions that are hiding underneath it all.
The only way to navigate this tension between expertise and lived experience is to refuse to confuse the models with reality, refuse to confuse authority with truth, or precision with wisdom. That's the knowledge that truly empowers you to see the system clearly.